check the mic, make sure it's my cue. So it's my cue. Here I am. By the way, Mike said that, hey, you can end whenever you want to end this afternoon. And so, yeah, I know. Everybody else was leaving at a certain time, but I can keep talking, right? And so, but thanks again. As I've mentioned to Mike, I've so appreciated my time with all of you and the privilege to be here and to, talk about things that I've learned. I find as I get older, and some of you share this as well, that we become stewards not only of our gifts and our resources, but I think we also become stewards of our wisdom. The things, the lessons that life teaches us. I call this autobiographical wisdom. That all of us that through kind of the ups and downs in life, we get beat up and we walk with God, etc., that God builds wisdom into our lives. And so it's out of this wisdom, I think particularly as we get older, that's the thing that ultimately I think ministers to people. And so my presentation this morning and my message this time, in a lot of ways, this is just things I've learned over the years. I thought, I got involved in making disciples in 1970, so I've been at this, for 54 years, something like that. And I'd like to say that, hey, every year has been super productive, but they haven't. It's interesting as I write, and if you notice, I've got a couple of books out there, that I always learn these life lessons from writing. And in my most recent book, I learned this lesson about myself because I was talking about lifelong learning. And I realized how arrogant I've been most of my life. And arrogant being that in my first responsibility with the Navigators, as I thought back on my supervisor and how much he visited me and talked with me, I thought, in all those times, of 4 or 5 years I was involved with John Ed, I never asked him a question. Because I felt, I knew it all. I knew what to do. And this disciple-making stuff, I had it all together. And it's kind of like over the years you realize, man, there's a certain arrogance about me. And I learned some things through that. And it's taught me a sense, both of humility, but also the importance of just asking for advice. You'd think that this would be obvious stuff, but sometimes we get blinded to learning these things. And so I find in a lot of my writing, I'm simply writing about things that I've learned over the years, and in some ways, things I wish I would have applied, but I didn't at the time. But I've learned them now, and hopefully they can be helpful to others. And so this morning I talked about, this idea of a simple way of looking at disciple making. That disciple making is simply inviting people to walk with us as we walk with Jesus. And that walking, that Jesus set a model for it. He gives us the means to do it. And then he gives us some principles on making disciples. And then he sends us on mission. And this afternoon I want to address the subject of disciple making means going slow and deep. Slow and deep. And in some ways, these are not words we like in our culture at times. And in fact, I think that what I'm learning is that life is learning to live with a slow God in a culture of speed. And let me just explain what I mean by this. Let's talk about this culture of speed. It's interesting that I just got done reading an excellent book. I've recommended it to you pastors. It's a book called Slow Productivity. And in this book, the author traces, particularly in the white-collar business, as it were, and this relates to the pastoral business that we're in, is that we were unable to, in one sense, identify the things that help us to measure success. So what we've done over the years, decades, is we assume that a success is the amount of things that we do. So the busier we are, the more productive we are. For example, it used to be that the wealthy at one time were measured by their leisure that they had rather than the amount that they did. And today, the wealthy and the CEOs are measured by how busy they are. And so it is with us sometimes, particularly in the pastoral ministry, that we assume that the more busy someone is, they must be more productive. And so we're caught in this kind of race of productivity. We're caught in cell phone and internet connections. It's kind of like my wife just bought we bought a new laptop, and the first question is, man, what's the speed of this thing? Or she sits down and says, wow, this is a whole lot faster than it used to be. And we love the speed. The other morning, I woke up and found an Amazon package delivered to me that I'd ordered the night before. And that Amazon now will deliver some things the same day, if not within 24 hours. And we love that speed. The Chinese ideogram for busy is, get this, it's made up of 2 characters, heart and killing. There's something about speed, right, that kind of kills our hearts if we let it. Do you know that skimming now is a dominant form of reading? Now, I've been publishing a blog post, and if you want to read some of them, you can go to alongsider.com. That's alongsider.com. And but in writing this blog post, I consulted with the person that manages my website, and I said that, hey, I've always heard that in writing a blog post, you want to keep it as short as possible. And he said, no, that's not necessarily the case, because what happens when people read your blogs is they skim it. What they're looking for is key points that are in bold letters, or that they're numbered 1, 2, 3, and 4. Doesn't make any difference how long it is. They're just going to skim it to read it. And so skimming is now the dominant form of reading. The reality is that our neural circuits, the neural circuits needed for reading and thinking deeply with sustained concentration, are weakening. Now, this isn't just an old guy who's commenting on, I can't quite get social media, but this is what research is showing. And that because the rapidity of social media, the rapidity of reading, etc., that we're losing the ability to do deep thinking. And that's kind of scary, isn't it? But we're caught up in that sense of speed, and I thought we need to heed Psalm 46:10, and this is out of the Message translation. And I love this. Psalm 46:10 says, "Step out of the traffic," and that's exclamation point. "Take a long, loving look at me, your high God, above politics, above everything." And sometimes we're caught up in the speed of life, and that we need to step out of this traffic of social media, of activities to do, of overjammed schedules. We need to take a long, loving look at God, don't we? Just need to step out of that traffic. One author says that we walk with a 3-mile-per-hour God. And 3 miles per hour is the typical speed at which we walk. So we described, like this morning, when we walk with God, it's kind of like we're walking about 3 miles an hour. And so we walk with a 3-mile-an-hour God, and sometimes he's a lot slower in how he does things than we would like it to be, particularly in this culture of speed. I was talking about this idea of walking slowly with God and how we have a slow God with some of the Pentecostal friends I'm involved with, and they said, well, in some circles, the idea of slowness is not a good thing. And, my charismatic friends, and again, we want to believe that, and it's true that God wants to work right now. He wants to heal you right now. He wants to change you right now, and he does want to do those things, and he can do those things. And for a lot of us, he probably has done those things in our lives. But a lot of times, it's a slow process, isn't it? I love this passage in Exodus 23, and Israel's right on the verge of going into the Promised Land. And in Exodus 23, starting in verse 28, God says, "And I will send hornets before you, which shall drive out the Hivites, the Canaanites, and the Hittites from before you." And then get this. He says, "I will not drive them out from before you in 1 year, lest the land become desolate and the wild beasts multiply against you. Little by little, I will drive them out before you until you've increased and possessed the land." It's that Spirit of God. I could do this instantly. In less than a year, I could drive them out. But little by little, I'm going to do this so you're prepared to possess the land. And I thought a lot of times that's what growth is, isn't it? Both in our personal lives, in our church lives. But sometimes it's just little by little that God's at work, driving these wild beasts out before us. Little by little, he wants to change us. We know the passage in 2 Peter 3, 8 and 9, that God says, hey, 1,000 years, it's like a day. And he's not slow concerning his promise, and he's working things out. 400 years between Malachi and Matthew, right? And God is sometimes slow in how he works, and so it is in our own lives as we think about discipling people. Because we want to be in a hurry. We want to see, change happens at the end of the 9-week curriculum that we've got them involved in. And what I thought about is when we invite people to walk with us as we walk with Jesus, we're inviting them oftentimes to a slow journey. Disciple making is not for those who want quick results, a series of boxes to check, or guaranteed success. A lot of times what I've seen in the growth of people's lives, in my own life as well, we go through seasons of life, don't we? Sometimes there's a winter season of life, and it's kind of like life is dormant. We don't see a whole lot of change. We don't see a whole lot of things happening. And I would suggest that in church life, as a pastor, you see that. Sometimes there's a sense of dormancy, But the dormancy is there because it's preparing you for the spring and then for the summer. And we would all like to live in the summertime, where we enjoy the luxuriousness of what's going on, and there's speed, and there's growth, and there's lushness, and there's green. Well, sometimes it's seasonal, isn't it? And sometimes it's slow. And so that what I'd like to address this morning is 3 practices of slow disciple making. And again, these are things that I've learned over the years by doing this. So it's 3 practices of slow disciple making. The first one is that we go slow for excellence. We go slow for excellence. And I like to define or describe excellence as being that it's doing our best with the resources we have. It's not perfection, but we're doing the best we can with the resources we have. 1 Corinthians 14:12, Paul says that, well, if you're going to excel in anything, do what? Excel in building up the church. In Mark 7:37, I love this verse about Jesus. It says, and they were astonished beyond all measure. And again, how do you be astonished beyond all measure? In other words, you can't measure it, their astonishment. Why? Because they said, because he did everything well. There was that spirit of excellence about Jesus. In Daniel 7:22, it says, and this Daniel became, promoted above all the other presidents and satraps, other rulers, administrators, because of what? An excellent spirit was in him. And there was that spirit of excellence that he had. He did everything well to the best of his ability with the resources that he had. The classic devotional writer Oswald Chambers makes a comment. He says, we have to be exceptional in ordinary things, to be holy in mean streets. Now, mean streets means just everyday streets, okay? And then he says, and this is not learned in 5 minutes. We have to be exceptional in ordinary things, to be holy in mean streets, and this is not learned in 5 minutes. We can't take pills to get an automatic spiritual growth. Sometimes it's really slow. And so it is as we minister to people and disciple people. Sometimes it's slow, but we need to do it with a spirit of excellence. This is a description of the philosophy behind Shaker Furniture and the building of Shaker Furniture. And the philosophy is that you make every product better than it's ever been done before. Make the parts you cannot see as well as the parts you can see. Use only the best material, even for the most everyday items. Give the same attention to the smallest detail as you do the largest. Design every item you make to last forever. Isn't that a great description of what it should be as we think about our disciple-making ministry? That we're taking the time to be involved in those kind of quiet, silent, hidden places in our lives and the lives of others. And so they're going to last forever. I don't know, I'm a Mac user, and I've been using a Mac ever since it came out. And, part of being a Mac user is you're part of this cult out there to some degree. And do you know that in the first Mac that Steve Jobs designed, one of the things that Jobs wanted to do was to marry aesthetics, that is something that's beautiful, with function. In other words, why not give a sense of beauty to this thing called a computer? And so when he designed his first Mac, he was committed to the fact that not only did I want to make the outside something attractive, but he'd had his engineers design the circuit board, what you don't see, to be attractive as well. And he was obsessive about this. And then when they perfected it to his sense of what beauty and excellence looked like, he had his engineers autograph the inside of the circuit board. And so it was kind of engraved in his circuit board. So in all those original first Macs, all the designers' names were inside on that circuit board, because he felt that every artist should sign what they create. So whether it's kind of this functional beauty of a Mac or the inside of the circuit board, that there should be a beauty and an excellence by which we do that. And because people's lives are so important, so precious to God, we need to think about how do we minister to them with excellence. I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but my father came to faith when he was in his early 40s. And I was in high school at the time, and I began to see some changes in my dad's life as a result of this decision he'd made. And I noticed that he took this small room off from our dining room, which wasn't much bigger than a closet, and he turned it into an office for himself. Now, my dad was a meat cutter his entire life, a butcher. My mom worked in the school cafeteria. My dad was dressing deer into his 80s. he'd have this part-time job during hunting season, and this one particular farm market would, hire him, and he just loved cutting meat. And so he was a regular guy. But my dad began to, little by little, buy some commentaries, buy some study Bibles, and he began to, teach Sunday school classes. He had a little Bible study in his mobile home park for years, and he was just a regular guy. And when my dad passed away, about 4 years after my mom passed away, again, my parents didn't have much. Essentially, what I inherited from my father was a series of commentaries that he had. And you know what else I inherited? It was a file containing a lot of his notes from the Bible studies that he created himself, and then the questions that he asked. And so I've got this file folder of his Bible studies that he led in his little mobile home trailer park for years. And I inherited some of his commentaries, and it's fun reading through his commentaries because he'd make little margins on the side, make little notes. And I'll never forget one of them. He says, he's got his underlined in red, this statement. It says, "too liberal" on the side. And, but, I look at this, and my dad spent a lot. Now, my dad would get up at 5 in the morning to go to work, and he'd get home about 5 or 6 at night. And then he had 1 or 2 nights a week he'd dedicate just to study the Bible. Now, again, my dad was a butcher, a regular guy. And he was discipled by the Gideons. So many Gideons in here. My dad was kind of discipled by the Gideons, by the Christian Businessmen's Committee, I don't know if the CBMC, and actually helped a little on the Navigators, the Billy Graham Association, all these different organizations, because my dad volunteered for anything. And they helped disciple him. But my dad was committed to the spirit of excellence. If I'm going to study the Bible, teach the Bible, lead people in Bible study, I want to do it well. And he did it well, because that was important to him. And so one of the first practices in slow disciple making is we need to do things well. The second principle is we go slow in order to love. We go slow in order to love. Now, I could quote, and we could look at a lot of verses on loving people, and we know a lot, but I'd like to look at love in a different way. I'd like to look at love through the lens of a farmer. All right? And as when one author the last decade has really influenced my life, he's actually a nationally known novelist, poet, and essayist, Wendell Berry. Wendell Berry is a farmer in Kentucky. He's now 90 years old. And but Wendell Berry writes about farming, and there's so much in his writings on these essays that relates to the church. It's just amazing. In fact, I'm thinking of writing a book someday, from the farm to the church. And we're talking about from the farm to the table. This is from the farm to the church. And Berry writes about successful farming, and he says successful farming starts with a simple act. Now get this. The simple act is to walk the land. He says the gait most congenial to agrarian thought and sensibility is walking. It's a gait best suited to paying attention and most permissive of stopping to look or think. Then when we walk the land as a farmer, or maybe you're walking the garden or your yard, that's kind of the gait, the step in front of another that encourages us to kind of stop and think. And then he says this statement with a certain amount of tongue-in-cheek, all right? He says, machines, companies, and politicians run. All right? And the farmer walks. Slowness is a virtue to the farmer. He or she knows that as speed increases, care declines, right? As speed increases, as we try to hurry things up, it's kind of like in cooking. My wife tells me this. In baking, the tendency is you want to speed up the process. But if you speed it up, you don't take the care, you're not going to get the product that you want. The faster we go, he says to the farmer, the less we see. As speed increases, care declines. That's why love is, first of all, what in 1 Corinthians? It's patient, right? You need to be patient. A farmer doesn't look only to enjoy the scenery, but to study the land in order to care for it. That I study the land to find out what's going to grow the best here. Where is it going to grow the best? Because I know the land, and so it is with people. That if we love people, we're going to slow down to be able to study them and to learn about them. When I first moved to Ohio State, one of my responsibilities was in leadership development, and I had 3 men that were involved in a leadership development program with me. And like probably many of you, Rob, we've got our leadership goals, and we got kind of our leadership curriculum, and I'm pressing ahead with this stuff, and about 4 months into it, I thought, I'm not sure this is working all that well. And I'm not seeing the progress in these guys. I'm not seeing the excitement that I thought I'd see at that point in time. So I kind of stopped, right? I slowed down, And I thought, why, Lord, is that happening? And then as I thought about it, I thought, all three of these men are very different. One guy, Steve, was a highly motivated, high performance, high capacity individual. And Ohio State, you got about 5,000 students in a dorm, and he's the kind of guy, you appreciate this, Rob. I says, see that dorm, Steve? 5,000 students, go get it. And he'd go get it. He was that kind of a leader. And he thrived on responsibility and challenge. Now, Tom had a master's degree in history, and I found with Tom, for his development, if I gave him a stack of books and write me a couple of papers, he's motivated, and he would go and do that. The third guy, Dave, as I thought about Dave, I thought, Dave just wants to be my buddy. He's the guy that volunteered to babysit our kids. He's the guy that come over and play basketball on a weekend. He just wanted to be my buddy. Do you see what I'm looking at here? All three of these men were very different. And how is I going to craft, in a sense, take into account their differences for their sense of leadership development? I needed to slow down. And I needed to slow down to care for them, to think about them and to their needs. And so we go slow in order to love people. It's the third principle, is we go slow to go deep. We go slow to go deep, not only in our lives, but in the lives of others. We all have our favorite verses in the Bible, verses that encourage us, challenge us, we love to recite. And I've often thought, well, what's one of my saddest verses in the Bible? And that's a little different way of looking at it. But one of my saddest verses in the Bible is in Judges 2, 7 through 12. And Judges, and we're familiar with that passage. Let me just read parts of it for us. In Judges 2, 7 through 12. It says that, and the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great work that the Lord had done for Israel. And Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110 years, and they buried him within the boundaries of his inheritance. And all that generation also were gathered to their fathers. So in other words, all of his peers, his contemporaries, were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals, and they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers. Now again, there's a variety of observations we can make as to why they departed from, serving God. I would suggest that one hint here is they observed what God had done, for Joshua and his contemporaries, but they had not experienced that firsthand for themselves. They had not developed a sense of conviction that this is what God is like. They were content to rest on other people's beliefs and experiences, and they didn't own it for themselves. There wasn't that sense of conviction for them of what it meant to walk with God. I think as we talk about discipling people, again, we're talking about not just passing on information, but helping people to build conviction. And conviction is kind of that DNA of who we are. It's kind of what we do when nobody is looking. Conviction is a daily practice of a priority that we have in our lives. And we're helping people to grow and to develop in conviction, not just simply of information. Convictions emerge through life's trials, and they're intentionally built into a life. What I'd like to say is that I like to call this groovy disciple making. And it's groovy not simply because, I'm a product of the 60s, but groovy in the sense of being an athlete or a musician. Because in an athlete, we talk about an athlete, particularly a pitcher, for example, they're in a groove, right? It's kind of like unconsciously, they're throwing one strike after another. Or the hitter, he's in a groove, and it's kind of like, man, he just can't miss when he steps up to bat. Or if you're a musician, you think about, I'm in a groove. I'm not even thinking about how I'm playing. I'm not even thinking about how I'm singing. It's something that just comes natural to me. It's just built into my life and into my life's routines. It's a groove that's taking place. And we need to help build grooves in people's lives and in our lives, because that's what it takes to kind of survive. So we're not going to turn away from the Lord. I mentioned this yesterday with the pastors. Peggy and I are grandparents of two children. They're twins, Leo and Ronan. And Leo and Ronan were born at 25 weeks. And they weighed about 1.5 pounds each. And they were in the neonatal unit at the Denver Children's Hospital for 6 months. So my son and daughter-in-law could not take their babies home. They lived in Colorado Springs, they had to commute back and forth to Denver to see their children. And when we'd go and visit them, these little babies, if you've ever been in a neonatal unit, they've got all these wires hooked up to them, and they're on all these monitors. And so that little heart rate goes down, something about the oxygen, the little monitors start beeping. And it's kind of like we're sitting there, I was sitting there visiting them one time, and it's kind of like, got all these beeps going off. And my blood pressure's going up, my anxiety's going up. But my son's, that's okay, Dad. This is just what happens. And he explains to me what's going on. And so you talk about stress that my son and daughter-in-law went through, the stress that we experienced as parents. I mean, when they did come home, my one grandson had to be life-flighted back to the hospital within 2 weeks. And so that now they're normal, 6-year-old little guys in first grade having a lot of fun. They're hiking because they live in Colorado Springs. Ryan wrote me, this was last summer, he said, well, we took the longest hike yet. I think it was like 4 miles with these little guys, and he never carried them. And so they're a miracle twins, and God miraculously protected them, and they're growing, and they're healthy. But we really went through some hard times, particularly Peggy and I, because we're distanced from them. And it's hard to go and help them because, they're going back and forth to the hospital, and it's just a stress time for them. And you know how it is. Sometimes as grandparents, we get in the way rather than being a help. And so Peggy and I really struggled with that whole situation. How do we help our children? We're anxious for them. And so one day in my quiet time, I'm reading along, and I came across Romans 12:12. And this little verse the Lord gave me, that gave me a sense of hope. And how do I respond in this situation? And in 12:12, Paul writes, rejoice in hope, be patient in tribulation, be constant in prayer. I thought, Lord, yeah, that's what I need to do. I need to be patient. I need to be constant in prayer. I need to rejoice in the hope that we're believing in the hope that you're going to heal these little guys and give them, a life ahead of them. And after I wrote that verse down and I, put it in my quiet time journal, about a week later, Peggy and I are visiting this craft fair, and a lot of times at craft fair you have the guys that are selling the plaques, and they've engraved stuff, in the plaques, and I saw a plaque engraved with what? Romans 12:8. And I thought, I got to have that. So I plunked down my $30 and bought it, and I put it up on the wall in my study. And so that, man, whenever I'd struggle and get anxiety, I'd look up at that verse. And Lord, this is how I need to respond right now to you. But our ability to do that, because the Lord, through other people, discipling Peggy and I, had built some grooves into our lives. And so when hard times come up, we settled into these grooves of prayer, grooves of going to God and His Word. We were experiencing this groovy life. And we were naturally moving in that way. And so there was a sense of depth in our lives that was built in by somebody helping us develop these habits, these convictions about seeking God, about praying, about being in His Word. And so as we're discipling people, we want to go slow in order to go deep in people's lives, in our lives and the lives of others. The author Richard Foster writes that superficiality is a curse of our age. The desperate need today is not for a greater number of intelligent people or gifted people, but for deep people. We're people who don't live in the shallows, but we live in the depths of life. And that takes a little effort to do that, doesn't it? We trust the Holy Spirit, but at the same time we also stop and we slow down and we say, Lord, what do you want to teach us in this time? Lord, teach us to persevere. Lord, give me insights from your word. We settled into those grooves that have been built into our lives to give us a sense of hope and of perseverance. So disciple making is not for those who seek quick results, a series of boxes to check, or guaranteed success. I would say today, in some ways, that we need to be groovy people, deeper people, than maybe ever before. I find that in my, as I, age here, you get involved with other seniors, and I find that sometimes with seniors, we have I call them the 3 Ps that we talk about. We talk about physicians, right? We talk about prescriptions that we're taking. And the third is we talk about politics. This country is going to hell in a handbasket, right? This election coming up is the most important election in our lifetime. Well, I hear that about every 8 years, And I decided I'm just tired of talking about these things. And I'm really tired about talking about these cultural issues. And I thought, Lord, give me perspective when I'm in these conversations, because we get into those conversations, those ruts, right? And and I thought, Lord, give me what can I say? How do I think differently? And so the passage that came to mind is Jesus is, in Matthew, let's see now, 24. And again, it's his discourse on the second coming, and I'm not going to use this as a springboard to talk about Jesus' return or the imminency of it. Don't want to touch on that at all. But I think there's some interesting statements. It says, starting in verse 4, and Jesus answered them, see that no one leads you astray. For many of you will come in my name, saying, I'm the Christ, and will lead many astray. We keep looking for the leader on the white horse, don't we? That's going to somehow help solve all of our problems. Hey, we're not the first generation that's done this. Jesus says, that's going to be a fact of life. He says, and you're going to hear wars and rumors of wars. How many wars are going down around right now in our world? See that you're not alarmed. He says, don't be alarmed by this. For this must take place, but the end is near. Nation's going to rise up against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There's going to be famines and earthquakes and floods and hurricanes. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. And then he goes on, but make sure for yourself that, who endures to the end will be saved. And again, I'm not going to get into a discussion on salvation, but I think it does speak in a principled way of our choosing to be faithful in the place that God has placed us in, and of choosing to think about the kingdom and not just simply the circumstances that we're in. And to have that kind of mental attitude means that we need to be people of depth. And we're not wrapped up in all of the politics and all this stuff swirling around it, but we're learning to think in kingdom ways about life as we experience it right now. And that means we're people of depth. And that means sometimes we have to slow down. That means we've got to go back to the scriptures and say, well, Lord, how do I deal with situations right now? Of choosing to be deep people and not superficial people. And of choosing to disciple people in deep ways, not superficial ways. So when we ask people to walk with me, as I walk with Jesus, sometimes we're asking them to, hey, this is a walk where we're going to go slow, but we're going to go deep. And for us as disciple makers, we want to go slow for that sense of excellence. People are really important to God. I don't want to approach this in haphazard ways. I want to do this with a spirit of excellence. That is, I'm doing the best I can with the resources that I have. When we go slow and we go deep, we go slow to love. Again, I just need to slow down sometime, and slowing down means to care. It means taking a look. It means studying people. It means doing the thing that's going to build them up. That means I need to slow down in life to take the time to do that. And then we need to slow down to go deep, to be men and women of conviction, that we're encouraging conviction in the lives of others, and we're developing conviction for ourselves. That convictions is that consistent practice of priority. A conviction is what's rooted in our DNA. A conviction is what we do when nobody else is looking. And so when we struggled with our grandchildren, nobody was really looking. We could have just not prayed. We could have not sought God. We could have not gotten into the scriptures. But God had used people to build those grooves into our lives that helped us to go deep. And so it is today in this political climate. We can either join the bandwagon on a whole variety of things, or we can think, okay, Lord, how do I go slow? I'm trusting you. I'm thinking about the kingdom, and I'm not getting wrapped up in all the speed around me that wants to suck me into it. So my challenge to you, this afternoon, is that as we invite people to walk with me, as I walk with Jesus, that means going slow and deep. We want to go slow for excellence. We want to go slow to love. And we want to go slow to go deep in our lives and in the lives of the people that we're investing in. So let me pray for us in closing. Father, help us in this world in which things are speeding up every day. That speed is kind of the currency of today, that we measure effectiveness and we measure excellence, we measure our productivity by speed. And yet you call us, Father, to step out of the traffic, take a long, loving look at you. And that means slowing down. So, Father, help us to be people who slow down. And that we slow down, to do things well, to do things excellently. We slow down in order to love and to care for people. And we slow down in order to go deep, to build convictions in people's lives. We want to move, Father, from just amassing information to having conviction about life and about ministry. And so that we're responding in kingdom ways. There are grooves built into our lives that drive us back to you. Help us, Father, to be people like that. And help us to be people who minister to others in this way, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen.